What she left behind would transform a bitter man's soul and save an entire community from destruction. This is the story of how one act of mercy created a miracle that defied all expectations. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness will restore your faith in human kindness. The year was 1882, and the Wyoming territory was bleeding dry. 3 years of drought had turned fertile farmland into cracked wasteland, and the approaching winter promised only death for those who couldn't pay their debts. Banks were foreclosing on family ranches that had stood for generations, and desperate men were making desperate choices. In the small town of Cedar Ridge, where the morning mist carried the scent of dying dreams, neighbors had become strangers, and trust was as scarce as rain. This was a place where survival had murdered compassion, and where even good men were learning to look away from suffering. Samuel McKinnon owned the largest ranch in Cedar Ridge, but wealth had not brought him peace. At 52, he was known for his iron will and his ruthless business sense, traits that had kept his family's legacy alive while others perished. But Samuel carried a wound deeper than drought. 5 years earlier, his wife Martha had died giving birth to their stillborn son, leaving him alone in a house too big for one man's grief. He'd learned to bury his pain beneath layers of stern practicality, telling himself that sentiment was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford. Yet sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, he'd catch himself setting 2 cups for coffee, forgetting that mercy had abandoned his heart along with love. On a gray October morning, Clara Whitmore knocked on Samuel's door with trembling hands and hollow eyes. The 34-year-old widow owed him $800, money her late husband had borrowed to buy seed that never grew. Clara stood on his porch with her 2 young children hiding behind her worn skirts, her voice barely a whisper as she begged for more time. In her face, Samuel saw every widow the drought had created, every child who'd learned hunger too young. She had nothing left to offer except the deed to her small cabin and the 40 acres that surrounded it, land worth less than half what she owed. It should have been simple: take the land, evict the family, and move on. But something in Clara's desperate dignity stirred memories Samuel had tried to forget, creating a moral crossroads that would define both their destinies. Samuel's business partner, Robert Hayes, sat across from him in the ranch office, his face red with disbelief. The ledger lay open between them, showing Clara Whitmore's debt in stark black ink. Robert's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You can't be serious, Sam. $800 is $800. The smell of leather and tobacco filled the room as Robert paced, his boots clicking against the wooden floor with increasing agitation. Samuel could feel the weight of his decision settling in his chest like a stone, but he'd already spoken the words that couldn't be taken back. He was forgiving Clara's debt entirely. Robert slammed his fist on the desk, making the oil lamp flicker. "That woman's got you thinking with your heart instead of your head. This drought's made beggars of us all, and you're just encouraging more of them to come knocking." Samuel watched his partner's reflection in the window, seeing not just anger but fear that kindness was a weakness they couldn't afford. The autumn wind rattled the glass, carrying with it the distant sound of Clara's children playing in her yard, their laughter a fragile thing in the growing darkness of the approaching winter. But Samuel had seen something in Clara's eyes that reminded him of Martha, not her beauty, but her quiet strength in the face of impossible odds. He'd made his choice, and Robert's fury only confirmed that he was standing at the edge of something larger than business. "Some debts can't be collected, Robert. Some things matter more than money." The words felt strange in his mouth, as if spoken by the man he used to be before grief had hardened his heart into stone. As Robert stormed out, slamming the door behind him, Samuel sat alone with his decision. The silence that followed felt heavy with consequence, as if the entire universe was holding its breath. What he didn't know was that Clara Whitmore was about to give him something far more valuable than the $800 he'd just forgiven. But that revelation was still 3 months away, and winter was coming fast. Word of Samuel's mercy spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, and within days, desperate families began arriving at his ranch. They came in wagons loaded with sick children and empty stomachs, each carrying debts they couldn't pay and stories that would break a lesser man's heart. Samuel found himself facing not one Clara Whitmore, but dozens, each one a mirror reflecting the community's suffering. The sound of crying babies and pleading voices filled his yard from dawn until dusk, creating a symphony of desperation that haunted his dreams. His foreman, Tom Bradley, approached him with growing concern etched in his weathered face. "Boss, we've got 23 families camped on your property now. They're eating through our winter supplies, and some of the hands are getting nervous." The smell of wood smoke and cooking beans drifted across the ranch as the desperate families tried to make the best of their temporary sanctuary. Samuel could see the fear in Tom's eyes, the same fear he'd seen in Robert's face, the terror that compassion would bankrupt them all. But Samuel couldn't bring himself to turn them away. Each face reminded him of Clara's quiet dignity, of the way she'd stood on his porch asking not for charity, but for a chance. He'd opened a door he couldn't close, and now his ranch had become an unofficial refuge for the drought's victims. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to save one family, he'd somehow inherited responsibility for half the county. His supplies were dwindling, his partner had abandoned him, and winter was still approaching with the inexorable certainty of death. As night fell over the makeshift camp, Samuel stood on his porch and wondered if mercy was just another word for suicide. In the distance, he could see Clara's cabin glowing with warm lamplight, her children safe and fed because of his decision. But for every Clara he'd saved, 10 more had appeared, and he was beginning to understand that some acts of kindness create obligations that extend far beyond the original gesture. The weight of their trust pressed down on him like the darkening sky, and Samuel McKinnon realized he'd become something he'd never intended to be, a savior to people who had nowhere else to turn. The bank president, Jonathan Carlyle, arrived at Samuel's ranch on a crisp November morning, his polished boots and expensive coat a stark contrast to the ragged families camped in the yard. Carlyle's voice carried the authority of foreclosure and the promise of legal action as he surveyed the scene with obvious disgust. "This has gone far enough, McKinnon. You're harboring debtors and undermining the entire financial structure of this community." The smell of his cologne mixed uneasily with the scent of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, creating an olfactory reminder of the vast gulf between privilege and desperation. Behind Carlyle stood Sheriff Morrison, his hand resting uncomfortably on his gun belt. Morrison had been a friend of Samuel's for 20 years, but friendship meant little when the bank held the mortgage on half the town. "Sam, I've got legal papers here. These people need to be moved off your land, and their debts need to be honored. We can't have every debtor in the territory thinking they can just not pay." The sheriff's voice carried genuine regret, but also the weight of a system that had no room for mercy in its calculations. Samuel felt the eyes of every desperate family fixed on him, their children clinging to their mother's skirts as they waited to see if their sanctuary would survive this official challenge. The sound of horses stamping nervously filled the air, punctuated by the soft weeping of a woman who understood that hope was about to be crushed beneath the heel of legal obligation. In that moment, Samuel realized that his act of kindness toward Clara had made him an enemy of every established power in Cedar Ridge. "These people aren't going anywhere," Samuel said quietly, but his words carried across the yard like a thunderclap. He could see Clara watching from her cabin window, her face pale with understanding. The battle lines had been drawn, and Samuel McKinnon had just declared war on a system that crushed the weak and rewarded only the ruthless. But as Carlyle and Morrison rode away with threats of legal action and financial ruin, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that Clara Whitmore held the key to something that would make this sacrifice worthwhile. He just didn't know what it was yet. That night, Samuel sat alone in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of his prosperity. The account book spread before him told a story of mathematical certainty. At the current rate of expenditure, he would be bankrupt within 2 months. The families he was sheltering consumed supplies faster than his depleted herds could provide, and with winter tightening its grip on Wyoming, there would be no relief until spring. The sound of his own breathing seemed too loud in the silence, mixing with the distant murmur of voices from the camp outside his window. He pulled out Martha's photograph, her gentle smile mocking his current predicament. "What would you do?" he whispered to the empty room, but the dead offered no counsel to the living. The weight of 23 families pressed against his chest like a physical thing, each breath a reminder of the responsibility he'd accepted when he forgave Clara's debt. He thought of his own legacy, the ranch his grandfather had carved from wilderness, the cattle brand that had meant something in this harsh country. All of it was about to be sacrificed on the altar of an old man's momentary compassion. The rational choice was clear: send the families away, reclaim what he could of his losses, and salvage what remained of his fortune. Robert Hayes had been right. Sentiment was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford. Samuel's fingers traced the edge of Martha's photograph, remembering her voice as she'd spoken of the children they would raise, the legacy of kindness they would leave behind. But Martha was gone, their child was gone, and Samuel was 52 years old with nothing to show for his mercy except empty coffers and the bitter taste of impending failure. Outside, he could hear the sound of children laughing despite their circumstances, their joy untouched by the adult understanding of what winter would bring. Among those voices he recognized Clara's daughter Sarah, a 6-year-old girl who reminded him painfully of the child he'd never had. The sound of her laughter cut through his doubt like a knife, reminding him that some things couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. But doubt was a poison that worked slowly, and Samuel McKinnon spent that long night wondering if he'd confused weakness for strength, and whether his act of mercy would ultimately destroy everything he'd worked to build. 3 days before Christmas, Clara Whitmore collapsed in her cabin doorway. Samuel found her there when he came to deliver supplies, her face gray with exhaustion and her breathing shallow as winter air. Dr. Patterson arrived within the hour, his grim expression telling Samuel everything he needed to know before the man spoke a single word. "She's been sick for months, Sam. Consumption. She's been hiding it, trying to stay strong for her children." The smell of carbolic acid and impending death filled the small cabin, mixing with the scent of pine boughs Clara had gathered to make Christmas cheerful for her little ones. As Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, she gripped Samuel's hand with surprising strength. "There's something I need to tell you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind rattling the cabin windows. But before she could continue, a violent coughing fit seized her, flecking her lips with blood and stealing her words. Dr. Patterson shook his head grimly. "She doesn't have long. A few days at most." The weight of that pronouncement settled over the cabin like a shroud, transforming Clara's warm little home into a place where hope went to die. Samuel sat beside her bed through the night, watching over a woman whose dignity had inspired his greatest act of mercy. Her children slept in the next room, unaware that their mother was slipping away like smoke on the winter wind. In her fevered dreams, Clara spoke of secrets buried and promises kept, of something precious hidden where only the worthy would find it. Her words made little sense, fragmented by illness and the approach of death, but Samuel sensed that Clara Whitmore had been carrying more than just the weight of debt and desperation. As dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, Clara's breathing grew more labored. She opened her eyes one final time, fixing Samuel with a gaze that held both gratitude and urgent purpose. "The well," she whispered, her voice like autumn leaves. "Behind the cabin. When the ground thaws, dig deep. What I buried there, it's for you. For what you gave us." Before Samuel could ask what she meant, Clara Whitmore closed her eyes and stepped quietly into whatever waited beyond the veil of life, leaving behind only the echo of words that would haunt him through the long winter months ahead. Clara's funeral took place on a bitter December morning, her plain wooden coffin surrounded by every family Samuel had sheltered. The sound of shoveling dirt mixed with muffled sobs as the small community laid to rest a woman who had become a symbol of their shared suffering. Samuel stood at the graveside holding Clara's orphan children, Sarah and young Michael, their small hands cold as ice despite their mittens. The weight of their trust pressed against his chest like a physical thing, a reminder that his mercy had created obligations that would outlive its original recipient. But even as they mourned Clara's passing, the wolves were circling. Jonathan Carlyle had returned with legal documents and a court order, his breath steaming in the cold air as he served Samuel with papers that would strip him of everything. "You have 30 days to clear these squatters off your land and settle your debts, McKinnon. This little charity experiment of yours is over." The bank president's words cut through the funeral atmosphere like a blade, his timing calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage on a man already burdened by grief and responsibility. The families looked to Samuel with desperate eyes, understanding that their sanctuary was about to be destroyed by the very system that had created their poverty. Children clung to their mothers' coats as the reality of eviction settled over the gathering like a heavy blanket. Sheriff Morrison stood behind Carlisle with obvious reluctance, his hand resting on legal papers that would make him complicit in turning dozens of families out into the Wyoming winter. The sound of wind through bare trees seemed to carry the promise of death for those too weak to survive another displacement. Samuel felt the full weight of his impossible situation crushing down on him like an avalanche. He'd spent everything he had to keep these people alive, and now the law was demanding payment he could never make. Clara's mysterious final words echoed in his mind, something about the well behind her cabin, something buried that was meant for him. But the ground was frozen solid, and even if he could dig, what could a dying widow possibly have hidden that would solve a problem this massive? As the mourners dispersed into the gray afternoon, Samuel McKinnon realized he was standing at the edge of an abyss that would swallow not just his fortune, but the lives of everyone who had trusted him to be their salvation. The January thaw came early that year, turning the frozen ground into muddy promise and giving Samuel his first opportunity to investigate Clara's cryptic final words. He stood behind her abandoned cabin with a shovel in his hands, feeling foolish as he searched for signs of disturbed earth near the old well. The sound of melting snow dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves, creating a rhythm that matched his heartbeat as he began to dig. Around him, the families he'd sheltered went about their morning routines, unaware that their benefactor was desperately searching for a miracle in the Wyoming mud. 3 feet down, his shovel struck something hard. Samuel's heart raced as he cleared away the remaining dirt, revealing a metal strongbox wrapped in oiled canvas. His hands trembled as he lifted it from the ground, the weight of it suggesting contents far more substantial than he'd dared hope. Inside the cabin, away from curious eyes, he opened Clara's final gift with the reverence of a man discovering buried treasure. What he found there defied every expectation: neat stacks of gold coins, land deeds to property across 3 states, and bank certificates worth more than his entire ranch. A letter lay folded beneath the wealth, written in Clara's careful hand and addressed simply to the man who showed mercy when the world had none left to give. Samuel's hands shook as he read her story. Clara Whitmore had been born Clara Montgomery, daughter of a silver mining magnate who died when she was 21. She'd inherited a fortune but had given it all up to marry a poor farmer she loved, keeping only enough hidden away to ensure her children's future. When her husband died and the drought destroyed their crops, she'd been too proud to use her secret wealth, choosing instead to live as her neighbors lived, to suffer as they suffered. But Clara's letter held more than explanation. It contained instructions. The fortune was his now, payment for the kindness he'd shown and the mercy he'd offered when she had nothing else to give. But it came with a condition that would test the very character that had earned it. He was to use the wealth not for himself, but for the community that had suffered alongside them. Every family he'd sheltered, every debt he'd forgiven, every act of compassion he'd shown, Clara had been watching, and her final gift was both reward and responsibility. Samuel McKinnon sat in that humble cabin holding enough wealth to save everyone, but only if he was willing to give it all away. As Samuel emerged from Clara's cabin with the strongbox under his arm, he found himself face to face with Robert Hayes and a group of armed men. His former partner's face was twisted with greed and desperation, his eyes fixed on the obvious weight of the metal box with predatory intensity. Well, looks like the widow had more than prayers and gratitude to offer after all. Robert's voice carried the bitter edge of a man who'd watched his conservative investments crumble while Samuel's mercy had apparently unearthed treasure beyond imagination. The sound of rifle bolts being pulled back echoed across the small yard as Robert's hired men surrounded Samuel. In the distance, the families he'd been sheltering watched with growing alarm, their children being quietly pulled behind cabin walls as adults recognized the smell of violence in the morning air. "You always were too soft, Sam. Too willing to trust, too quick to forgive. But I'm a practical man, and that box represents practical solutions to practical problems." Robert stepped closer, his hand resting on his gun belt with the casual confidence of a man who held all the cards. But Samuel McKinnon had learned something about himself during those long months of choosing mercy over profit. The wealth in his hands represented more than personal salvation. It was Clara's faith in the man she'd seen when he forgave her debt, her belief that true prosperity came not from taking but from giving. As Robert reached for the strongbox, Samuel made a choice that would define not just his own legacy, but the future of every soul who had trusted him with their lives. "You're right, Robert. I am too soft. But sometimes the soft parts are what make us human." What happened next would become legend in Cedar Ridge: how Samuel McKinnon faced down armed men with nothing but moral courage, how a dead woman's gift became the foundation for a new kind of prosperity, and how one man's mercy created ripples that would change an entire community forever. But even legends have to start somewhere, and this one began with a choice between fear and faith, between the safety of selfishness and the dangerous promise of true compassion. Samuel set the strongbox on the ground between himself and Robert, his movements deliberate and calm despite the rifles aimed at his chest. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard, creating a natural arena where mercy would either triumph or die beneath the harsh realities of frontier justice. "You want this fortune, Robert? Then you'll have to explain to every family here why their children don't deserve to eat." His voice carried across the space between them like a challenge, reaching the ears of dozens of desperate people who had learned to trust in Samuel McKinnon's goodness. The families began emerging from their shelters, not with weapons but with the quiet dignity of people who understood that their sanctuary was being threatened by the same greed that had created their suffering. Mothers stood with their children at their sides, fathers stepped forward with empty hands but full hearts, and even the oldest among them found the courage to face down men who would steal hope itself. The sound of footsteps in mud created a soft percussion as the community Samuel had saved gathered around him, their presence transforming a robbery into a moral judgment. Robert's hired guns began to shift nervously as they realized they weren't facing one man with a fortune, but an entire community with nothing left to lose. The weight of so many eyes, including those of children who had learned to see Samuel as a father figure, began to erode the certainty that had brought them here. "You're making a mistake, Sam," Robert said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. The smell of wood smoke and bacon from the breakfast fires mixed with the scent of fear, sweat, and uncertainty, creating an atmosphere thick with the potential for violence or redemption. Samuel opened the strongbox, revealing Clara's fortune to the morning light. Gold coins gleamed like captured sunlight, but instead of reaching for wealth, he began distributing it to the families around him. "Clara Whitmore left this for all of us," he announced, his voice strong enough to carry to every listening ear. "She believed that mercy creates more mercy, that kindness breeds abundance." As he placed coins and deeds into the calloused hands of farmers and laborers, Robert's armed men found themselves witnessing something they'd never seen before. A man who chose to give away everything he could have kept, transforming a moment of potential violence into an act of unprecedented generosity that would echo through the ages. Robert Hayes and his men rode away empty-handed that morning, defeated not by superior firepower but by the simple power of collective goodness. As their horses disappeared into the distance, the family Samuel had saved began to understand the true magnitude of Clara's gift. The fortune she'd hidden wasn't just money, it was the means to rebuild their lives, to purchase seed for spring planting, to pay off debts that had hung over them like death sentences. The sound of laughter began to replace the tension of confrontation as children ran between the adults, their joy infectious and untainted by the adult understanding of how close they'd come to losing everything. Samuel kept only enough wealth to maintain his ranch and continue his work as an unofficial guardian of the community's most vulnerable members. The rest was distributed according to need rather than want, with the understanding that prosperity shared was prosperity multiplied. Within months, Cedar Ridge had transformed from a dying frontier town into a thriving community where neighbors helped neighbors and no family went hungry. The sight of green fields and fat cattle became common again, but more importantly, the sound of hope had returned to a place where despair had once reigned supreme. Clara's orphan children, Sarah and Michael, found themselves with more than a dozen families willing to provide love and guidance. They grew up understanding that their mother's final act had saved not just their own futures, but the future of an entire community. Samuel McKinnon became known throughout Wyoming territory as the man who chose mercy over profit, and his ranch became a destination for those seeking proof that goodness could still triumph in a harsh world. The well behind Clara's cabin became a memorial to the power of hidden generosity and unexpected grace. Visitors would come from hundreds of miles away to hear the story of how a poor widow's secret fortune had rescued a community from despair, and how one man's decision to forgive a debt had unlocked blessings beyond imagination. Samuel lived to be 87, surrounded by the children and grandchildren of the families he'd saved. His legacy measured not in acres owned or cattle branded, but in lives transformed by the radical power of unconditional mercy. Clara Whitmore died believing that mercy creates miracles, and Samuel McKinnon proved her right by choosing compassion over comfort, community over personal gain. In a world that too often rewards selfishness with success, their story reminds us that the greatest treasures are often buried not in the ground, but in the human heart. What would you have done with Clara's fortune? Would you have kept it for yourself, or followed Samuel's example and shared it with those who needed it most? If this story of hidden generosity and unexpected redemption touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales from the Old West. Next week, we'll explore the story of a bankrupt sheriff who discovered that sometimes the law isn't found in books, but in the courage to do what's right. And remember, in a world that often feels cold and harsh, we all have the power to be someone else's Samuel McKinnon, someone else's miracle in disguise.